I'll give you a little bit of background on this particular event. The actual symposium takes place in the evening, tonight at 6 o'clock and tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And when we first started this business now over a decade ago, we thought that it was interesting to sit around with our speakers and some other experts just to chat about what was going to be talked about in the evening. And then those chats became so interesting that we thought we'd invite people to sit in on that. And thus began the Roundtable part of this symposium, but we have done away with the Roundtable. Now we just have a semicircle of chairs, but we also have an audience online. So we did open this up to the public, and we have, of course, some people here, and also possible to watch online. So we're going to have sort of a free-spirited discussion here, and anyone can chime in at any time, but we do have some topics that we want to address. And you have these handouts so that you have some idea of what it is that we are talking about. We have a very interesting panel here, experts, even an Olympic athlete. And so what I'm going to do right now is just go through, and I will ask each of our participants here to just say a couple of sentences about themselves. I always find that that makes for a better introduction than just railing off some data. We'll start with Dr. Nick.
Well, that's me.
That's
Hello, everyone. Dr. Nick Tiller. I'm an exercise scientist and researcher at Harbor-UCLA Medical Center. I'm also an author and a columnist at Skeptical Inquirer magazine. I like science and exercise, and I dislike pseudoscience, as you could probably have guessed.
Alex.
My name is Alex. I'm an Olympic athlete in sport of fencing, and right now I'm a second-year medical student at McGill, and I really like sport.
Jill.
Jill Barker. I'm the fitness columnist for Postmedia. I'm a runner, a swimmer, and a recent pickleball player.
Oh no, we lost you from tennis.
Beth.
Hi, I'm Beth Mansfield. I'm a specialist in sport dietetics. I have an exercise science background and a nutrition background. And I've always been on the move since I've been a little kid, so that's my interest in energy.
Chris.
My name is Chris. My primary interest in sports is really running. That's what I do. I like to run, so that's what I enjoy. It's not great on the knees, but there are worse things in life. So I highly recommend it to everybody. It's the greatest sport. It requires very little upkeep, very little equipment, and you can do it whenever, wherever you like without having to rely on other people. So it works well with a busy schedule.
But Chris, you forgot one important facet of your background.
What is that?
That you're an MD.
Oh, right. Yeah, I keep forgetting that. I occasionally practice medicine because I have to pay my rent, but I do a lot of other stuff as well.
Okay, I forgot about myself too. I direct our office here at McGill of Science and Society, and our mandate is to separate sense from nonsense. And as you can imagine, that keeps me pretty busy. But I'm also a beginning pickleball player. Yeah, it's a very interesting sport. So what we're going to do is discuss some interesting issues in the area of sport, mostly use and abuse, as the title of the symposium says. So I thought we would begin by focusing first on supplements. The first two discussion points here that you have in front of you deal with that. So let's address the first one here. Most people have heard of keto diets, which is a diet where you consume basically no carbohydrates to force the body to burn fat for energy. That fat decomposes to some smaller compounds which the body can then use as fuel. Hydroxybutyrate, for example, acetone. Now the question is, can you kind of take these as supplements? So instead of forcing your body to go into what is known as ketosis, take these substances, which the body would naturally produce anyway, which are a source of energy, but you're taking them in doses that are much higher than what the body naturally produces. And there are arguments here that if the body produces something naturally, then it's okay to take that from an outside source because there's no difference. There are those who say that no, because that is still sort of a form of cheating, because you're boosting a substance in your body, even though the body can naturally produce it, it cannot naturally produce it in those kind of amounts. So the question is, how should this be handled? Because many athletes now are drinking what are called keto drinks. And this is especially prevalent in bicycle racing, in the Tour de France. It's a big deal. They're all formulating their special keto drinks, and that is, so far, that is allowed. So, does anyone see any issue with this?
Well, there's many issues with it. First of all, I followed the Tour de France when I turned 40, and I did a little bit of an experiment. I went and picked up all the litter that came from what the riders threw out based on what they were eating, and it was bars. Sport bars and sport gels is the food that they were using, which are carbohydrate foods, which fuel them for the type of activity that they're doing. Now, you know, you can take whatever you want as a supplement, and I would argue that athletes are not taking ketones. You might find a very specific subgroup, you know, that might be trying to harness the power of any extra energy they can get in to help them in a very long, and Nick, you can probably comment on, you know, the sustained output that these riders are doing day after day for, you know, a month, with 1 day after every 6 days off. They're looking for every little bit of nutritional help and hydration help that they can get. So if there's a potential for them to get some extra help from ketone esters, they're going to try. But I think that's a very isolated group. They also tried medium chain triglycerides, which is another type of fat that you can get that bypasses the normal route of digestion of fat, and it's another way to get energy. But if you have too much of that as a supplement, gastric distress, you know, leaky bowels, a whole bunch of problems. So it's actually not as performance enhancing as you might think, even though clinical studies might show a slight improvement in some type of athletic performance. But maybe Nick, you might want to comment on, you know, the work that is actually done in terms of the clinical science around these products is at best shabby, and at most, there may be some small significant differences, but clinically they don't really pan out into anything really performance-wise.
Right, yeah, so I agree with everything you've said, and just for some context, I looked at a study recently on the use of ketones, exogenous ketones, in terms of supplementation and its effects on ultra-endurance performance, because if there's any kind of sport where you think, well, if we could maximize the ability to oxidize fats, then it would be in very long duration exercise where people are exercising at a relatively low intensity for a long period of time. It would be that kind of scenario where these things would be beneficial. And they found a very, very small performance benefit. Actually, no, it wasn't a performance benefit, but they found a small improvement in their ability to oxidize fats. And it was glycogen sparing, so it spared carbohydrate. But when we did the math, we found that for a typical 10-hour race, so remember this is ultra-endurance exercise, 10 hours is actually quite conservative for these athletes, it would cost about $300 in ketone supplements. These are just kind of over-the-counter supplements that you can buy in your local store. So for a typical 10-hour race, for a very small, possibly even negligible performance benefit, it's going to cost the athlete $300 or so, which is not really sustainable. And so, yeah, and I agree that a lot of the literature on this is decidedly unimpressive. A lot of the research that's done in sports nutrition circles is industry funded. And a big meta-analysis that was published, I think, last year found that the research that is industry funded in sports nutrition is much more likely to elicit positive effects. Go figure. So yeah, I'm not very impressed with the literature on ketones. I think the rationale is there, and there's definitely, it's intuitive, but it doesn't really pan out too much.
There's another aspect here is the cost, as you alluded to, especially with beta-hydroxybutyrate. This is not a simple compound to synthesize, I can tell you that. And it's very expensive. And the Tour de France teams, who of course are loaded with money, have...
Not all of them. Not all of them.
Not what?
Not all of them are loaded with money.
Not all of them are loaded with money. The smaller bottles that they drink of ketones, some of those, just the one little bottle costs $300. And the estimate is that this past year in Tour de France, totally about $100,000 was spent on keto drinks. I mean, there's a lot of money that is involved there. Okay, anyone else want to say anything about this particular aspect? The other sort of issue that the second point here raises is you go into a gym these days, and there are all kinds of supplements that they sell. I mean, protein powders, all kinds, of course, are at the front. But then there are others, creatine and numerous other supplements. And there are two issues here. One is whether or not those supplements do anything for the serious athlete or for the weekend athlete. And the other is, which is really a major issue, that what you think you're getting may not be what you're getting. Labeling is a huge problem with all kinds of so-called natural health products, and these are generally regulated as natural health products. You don't know whether or not the stuff in the bottle is what the label says. In fact, there have been numerous studies showing that that is not the case. And in some instances, it doesn't contain any of what it says on the label. Sometimes it's 100 or 200% more than what it says, and sometimes less. So this is a little bit different than the first topic that we dealt with the ketone bodies, which are, really serious athletes are the ones who look at that. But this business of just your ordinary dietary supplements, weekend athletes are into that. Chris?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say one of the things is that it's not the labeling that's the problem. It's the manufacturing process, and what industry is putting into the actual product, because there are about 4 different labeling regulations depending upon you've got a natural health product like a branched chain amino acid, whether you've got food for special dietary use like some type of protein concentrate mix, whether you've got a supplemental ingredient such as an amino acid, leucine, that's being put into a drink, or it's an actual sport food like a bar.
But it's up to the manufacturer to conform to the label.
Right.
It's their responsibility. So, and in many cases, they know that they're not conforming to the label. They know that they're cheating.
Yeah, I mean, there's a surprisingly high number of sexual enhancement products that get recalled because they contain Viagra in them, and one would assume that's not an accident. So, I mean, in many times, in many ways, they are putting stuff that they know shouldn't be in their product and not conforming with the label. And that's because they want one assumes that they do it because they want the product to sell. The problem with selling supplements in gyms is I imagine that's a major source of their revenue stream. Obviously, they make money by people selling, buying memberships for the gym, but they also make money by upselling you. So they have a vested interest in selling you this stuff, whether it works or not. An important point that I always try to sort of remind people whenever these issues come up is you sort of have to ask people, why are you exercising? And for most people, it's not because they want to win the Tour de France or think that they're going to become Olympic athletes. They do it because they want to be healthier. And if your goal is to be healthier, none of these products are really going to help you accomplish that. It's the simple act of getting up off the couch that has the greatest magnitude of benefit. And so if you can frame it in that way for the general population, I think a lot of them realize, like, oh yeah, I'm spending money on this product that's not actually going to help me achieve my goal, which for many people is the goal of just being healthier.
Well, I don't know. The biggest marketer of those kind of nutritional supplements at the gym is the biggest guy at the
Yes.
gym or the biggest woman at the gym.
Yeah.
I mean, people will follow, what that person does. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind with supplements is it's a culture of, it's not just a little bit, that people will take more and more. Thinking, well, if a little bit does a little bit more, then a little bit more will do a little bit more, and so on and so on. So, people can abuse supplements, and then again, if you're not really sure what's in that supplement, if you're taking any other type of medication, which I'm sure, or have any other kind of nutritional needs, it cannot be good for your overall health.
Alex, in the world of fencing, there must be some talk of drugs, supplements.
Yeah, for sure. I have a lot of teammates who use supplements, and I guess you would think that since we're at a high level, Olympic, elite, international, that we have more guidance on how to use supplements, what supplements are good for you, and what you shouldn't take. But it's kind of up for us to discuss and to weed through all the information by ourselves. It's really not more clear to Olympic athletes than it is to average consumers, which supplements are good for you. I think we're really concerned whether or not they're contaminated with things that are banned on the water list, because taking a supplement that's contaminated, you can be banned for a couple of years from your sport, and it's a long time in high performance sports. But really, for me, it was surprising that even at the high level, you don't have a lot of guidance over what is necessarily the best way forward for performance, or even just for health or recovery. You're kind of just guessing in the same way.
What would be an advantage in fencing? What are you looking for? Because it's not really endurance, right?
It's true. Yeah.
So what is regarded as sort of the holy grail in fencing? I mean, because I know that in some forms of shooting, for example, they try beta blockers because it makes their hand more steady, right? So is there anything like that in fencing?
Well, I think fencing is a unique sport where even if you're really physically fit and you have a lot of physical ability, you're not necessarily going to translate into a better athlete. So I think the drugs or the performance advantages that fencers seek physically are things that are going to help you recover faster, and this will let you train more, and it's the training more that's actually going to give you a performance advantage, and not necessarily being a little bit faster, a little bit stronger, a little bit more explosive. But just like any sport, I think if you recover faster, you can do more training, you don't have to rest as much, this is better for you.
Have you found anything that works?
Not particularly. I don't think in terms of supplements and nutrition, again, as athletes, we don't have that much more guidance compared to, I think, regular consumers. Really, it's listen to coach, and whatever coach says is best, you trust them. And for us, it was you try to sleep 8 hours a day, try to eat until you're full to recover, and you try to eat a balanced diet, but that's up to your own personal interpretation of what that means for you. So,
Which is a bit of a concern, really, when you think about it, because for context for the group, there was a very big study that was published in 2008 called the Columnist study, and it's been replicated a number of times since then. And they looked at over, I think, between 600 and 700 over-the-counter dietary supplements that were bought from 14 different countries. So these are perfectly safe, legal supplements, right? Your proteins, your mass gainers, your vitamins and minerals and things. And they found that about 15% of them were contaminated with anabolic androgenic steroids or other kinds of pro-hormones. So that's approximately 1 in 7. And again, these data have been replicated a bunch of times since then. So this is not, a very, very isolated case. It's not 1 in 100. This is, 1 in 7. And as we've just been saying, if you test positive in a drugs test, the ban is the same, whether or not it came from a contaminated supplement, whether you've inadvertently or deliberately doped, the ban is still the same, and it's a couple of years, and it can derail your career. So not having the guidance, especially at the elite level, I think is a big part of the problem, and there have been organizations set up to verify that what the contents are of these dietary supplements, and it's concerning that these athletes don't have more guidance on these issues.
I'm surprised that more teams, I know it's not necessarily a high-profile sport, and there's not a lot of money in sport in Canada, but that they don't have nutritionists, professional
They do.
certified.
They have, at all the national sports centers, they have sport dietitians that are there to give that guidance, and not only around, your recovery nutrition, your base nutrition, but also is there, an issue that might require some supplementation.
What are they reputable?
They're sport dietitians, yes, they're very reputable.
Okay.
So, and they're high-ranking professionals that work at these sports centers, but you have to have your team affiliated with that sports center. And so often, like what I would see is, I can remember working with one team with one athlete who was ready to go to the Olympics. I mean, she was on track, and her national organization actually wouldn't put the funding towards a sport dietitian. She came to see me and work with me individually. Then she moved on to what the team had hired, which was a chiropractor who said, I will give you your nutrition information, for free, and but you pay me as a chiro, but you can save money because I can give you that nutrition. And basically this young athlete went to eating, yeah, I know, Nick, it was unbelievable. And she knew way better, but this was a guidance she was getting, was a lot of supplementation, no carbohydrates until you've done your workout, using different types of rice brands, et cetera. Anyways, this young woman didn't make it to the Olympics, and she basically petered out, and her parents met with me, and I met with her probably about a year later to, what had happened, and she gave me the history, and I said, this is ridiculous. Like, there are sport professionals that are there available, but, the national organization decides where they're going to spend their money, Chris.
That's what I meant. Are the national organizations actually hiring people who know what they're doing, or are they?
They should be. I mean, it's been changing, and now they do have, dietitians hired at each of the national sports centers. But again, if you're at Milton, Ontario, at a sports center for cycling, your cyclists are all going to have the sport dietitian there. If the water polo's in Montreal, at the sports center here, you've got the dietitian there. You've got the rowers out in, rugby players Pacific sport, you've got the dietitian there. Fencing, I don't know where your national sport was affiliated with. Was it with a center? Did you have access to all those?
We did. We were at INS Quebec, so we were at the
Okay.
National Center, which I think is one of the best national centers
Yeah.
in Canada. It's really top-notch stuff. But it's just, it wasn't the norm for us to seek out advice beyond our maybe immediate team. And I think that's one of the things that's important, is that you have people who are certified and who have the right expertise, who are giving you guidance in their expertise, because the coach is not necessarily the best person to give you nutritional advice. They can be like a gateway to refer you to other people.
Exactly.
But often it's not like that. Often there's this big power dynamic, and if the coach doesn't refer you, what can you really do? You trust the coach, you trust that because they have all this technical knowledge, that it kind of, you extrapolated that they're going to be good at other things, and as an athlete you don't have a lot of power to maybe go out of your way, especially if the coach controls your funding and they control your playing
Right.
time. So I think it's a complicated situation for sure. Even if the services are available and they're accessible on paper, sometimes it's
Yeah.
difficult to access them.
And often it's the therapy, the massage therapy, the physiotherapy. It's all those things that the money is going
But
towards.
of course, the best source for nutritional information is the chiropractor, as we know.
Well, it's like a personal trainer, a lot of people, on the fitness side get their nutrition information from their personal trainer who doesn't have, any background to give that advice. So
This is a symptom of a broader problem, and it links very nicely in with my talk that I'm giving later at 6 o'clock. But actually, it's the fact that we have alternative therapy practitioners. Chiropractors are practitioners of alternative therapy. It's not science-based, it's not evidence-based, but they are so pervasive, they're so prevalent that people assume that they are evidence-based, that they are medical practitioners. When people get an injury, they think, oh, well, maybe I'll go and see the chiropractor. Or you have, you pull a muscle, you go and get acupuncture. And a lot of mainstream physiotherapists are now practicing acupuncture, despite the fact that these are alternative therapies. So it's the complementary and alternative medicine has snaked its way into mainstream practice until many people don't even know that they're getting alternative therapy. They'll go and see a chiropractor because they think it's mainstream.
Or a life coach, which is a burgeoning industry. Anyway, back to the supplements. Protein supplements are the number one supplement out there. You go into any gym and you see giant bottles. You go into these stores where they sell supplements, I mean, shelf upon shelf of protein. So what about the, quote, weekend athlete who gorges on proteins? Benefit, harm?
Well, with all things, it depends on what do you mean by protein supplements, how often, what are they doing? I mean, I think the vast majority of these things are not having any major effect one way or the other. Certainly somebody who consumes a lot of protein, whether they do that in their diet or via an exogenous source, could start to lead to some medical problems. There's been an ongoing debate in the literature about whether a high protein diet can affect kidney function, and for the most part it probably doesn't, but you can easily conceive of a situation where if somebody were to overdo it and take very, very high amounts of protein by exogenous sources, that could lead to some degree of acidification in the blood and perhaps lead to some problems. So there's always the potential there. The problem is it's not, most people are not going to suffer complications from these products, which is why they remain popular, because people take them and they're like, well, I feel fine. I mean, it's really people who go to the absolute extremes, like it's very hard to overdose on vitamin D, and yet I have seen people who have taken like 15 different vitamin D supplements simultaneously. They're the ones who end up with kidney stones. But the vast majority of the population may go out and take a vitamin D supplement, not realizing they actually aren't vitamin D deficient, right? So it's like the reason why these things are popular and the reason why they are probably such a significant revenue stream for many of these businesses is because many people take them. They are largely benign, and you know, for lack of a better term, the placebo effect makes them feel like they're doing something. An interesting aspect of human nature, people like to feel like they're doing something. I suspect that when you're hiring somebody who came up and told you is like, look, most of what you do isn't really going to matter. You can just do whatever you like. That's not going to be a popular thing for you to hear. When you're spending money to hire somebody to give you advice, you want a plan, you want a regimen, and that forces people to be definitive in areas where there probably isn't that much evidence base to say anything one way or the other.
I think, Beth, you said to me many times, food first, right? Would that be the case for that recreational, that weekend athlete?
Definitely. But, you know, we have a researcher here at McGill University out at, you know, in the School of Human Nutrition, Stephanie Chevalier, who's worked with Stu Phillips, who Nick, I think, knows pretty well. They're both key protein researchers looking at protein needs, not only in athletes, but with aging, gender-based differences, sex-based differences. And we know now that the actual recommended daily amount of protein is insufficient. Our needs are higher, but are they so high that we all need to be taking protein supplements, eating protein bars, having branched-chain amino acids? No, we just need to eat a lot better. And the key place to start is actually with aging older women. They're the ones, particularly over 65 and over 80, they're the ones who actually have the highest protein, you know, needs in terms of dealing with frailty and losing lean body mass. And the other issue with aging and protein is that we are actually not as sensitive to the impact of taking in proteins and the impact it has on our muscle protein synthesis. We're a little bit resistant to, you know, all the things that are happening in that process of trying to help maintain and potentially not lose lean body mass with aging. So we know aging is definitely one group, along with definitely people who do a lot more physical activity. But the other thing is, it's about timing, it's about amount of protein, it's also about spreading it out throughout the day. And most people don't eat enough protein-rich food at breakfast time. And all the research that has looked at protein has actually been done at breakfast time, because that's when we know we can see the biggest effect, because that's when people don't eat much protein-rich food, except maybe our keto diets and our paleo sort of diets, where they're actually bolusing in large amounts of protein, you know, at all meals. So breakfast is an actual time to think about, where if you are not interested in eating real food and you're trying to, you know, you're eating fruit and oatmeal, and really the only bit of protein is coming in your oatmeal, and you're not willing to have yogurt, drink milk, etc. Well, that's where we're seeing protein powders being mixed into people's oatmeal in the morning to kind of give them a bit of a bolus in the morning, and that's where it might be useful for someone that's aging.
So what you're saying is more bacon?
Well, the problem,
I'm joking.
yeah, we can get into that. That's
I'm
a whole
joking.
other issue with, nitrites and nitrates.
Okay, let's move on to what is now one of the most befuddling issues in the world of sport, and that's gene doping. I mean, now we're talking about something that is a lot more serious than whether or not you should be taking protein supplements. What we're really looking at here is the possibility of actually altering your body by inserting genes into the body. And where this is becoming really interesting is with something like erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that's secreted by the kidneys, and it triggers the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. As you know, red blood cells contain hemoglobin, and hemoglobin transports oxygen around the tissues, and muscles need oxygen to function. Now, injecting erythropoietin, or in fact storing your own blood and re-infusing it before a competition, this is not legal. But what if you could make your body naturally produce more erythropoietin by genetically altering your system? And this technically now is possible. This is what is known as gene doping. Where is testing going to go with this? Is it going to be possible to detect if someone has doped themselves in this fashion, that is actually modified their own genome so that they can produce more erythropoietin? And this is a very serious issue. It's very much discussed in the athletic community. Who wants to step in on that one?
I can go first, that's fine. So I think this is definitely the future of doping in sport. We've got to a sort of a limit now to what we can, the kind of physiological adaptations that we can evoke through drugs. I found it sort of struck a nerve with me, Joe, when you said that this idea of artificially stimulating EPO in the body, because you can do that by going to altitude, right?
Yeah.
So it's like it's a gray area, because where do we draw the line? At the moment, there's nothing to prohibit athletes from using from sleeping in an altitude tent or going on an altitude intervention to stimulate this production of erythropoietin and red blood cells. I think it's a bit of a minefield, because at the moment, the way that they will detect if an athlete is doping in this context is they use something called the athlete biological passport. In fact, they did that in the UK. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same in the US. But basically, they take data from the athlete throughout the year, and they get an understanding of what the normal sort of variability in the athlete's metrics are. So whether that's hemoglobin concentration or red blood cell count, whatever it happens to be, they get an idea of what is the normal day-to-day variation, week to week, month to month. Then if an athlete then undergoes some kind of doping regimen and they see this enormous spike in erythropoietin and red blood cells, then they deem, and if it's outside a certain range, then they deem them to have engaged in some kind of malpractice. How that's going to work with gene doping, I haven't a clue. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I'll just make a couple of points. Number one is, yes, it's technically maybe allowable now, but the law is whatever we say it is, right? Red means stop and green means go because of our common consent on the issue. So if we make a decision to ban this, then we can do that, and the laws and regulations will likely change as the technology changes. The other thing too, though, is like we talk about gene therapy, and yes, it is possible. I'm not sure that it's at a point where it's going to be widely available for everybody everywhere to get it done on a large enough scale that it's going to impact sport just yet. We may get to that point at some point. I'm not sure we're there yet. And it's going to require enough medical complicity, for lack of a better word, that I think it is going to be relatively easy to regulate, because these athletes are going to have to get that from somewhere. It's not as if they're buying contraband EPO off the internet, which is hard to market. I mean, to go to a medical facility to get gene therapy, that's going to require the complicity of medical professionals. Now, we have sort of seen that, right? I don't know if people remember the story from the last Olympics with that Russian figure skater who was getting the weirdest prescription medication I've ever seen. It's actually not available in Canada, and I can't remember the name, but it's an anti-angina medication that's used almost exclusively in Russia and maybe a few other countries. But I mean, she was 16 years old. She wasn't taking that for valid medical reasons. That's absurd. there was somebody on the team who, I don't know if they were a physician or whatever, but got her that medication. And so the rationale from my perspective in terms of regulating this and frankly banning it is that a lot of the people who are participating in the Olympics are young and they're vulnerable. And part of the reason to do this is to protect them from unscrupulous people who are part of their organizations who are there to win medals, right? And I would like to believe that sort of thing wouldn't happen in Canada, but I can easily imagine how it might happen in other countries like Russia, like China, where maybe the regulations are not as tight. So again, there's a moral and there's a legal and there's a scientific aspect to it. I don't know it's a problem that we have to deal with right now, but I can foresee how in a few years that might become an issue, especially as people start doing stuff.
Well, there's a long history of clandestine chemists and clandestine doctors, cooperating with athletes.
Ben Johnson?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And when you just look at the whole Balco business in the States, where baseball players were getting all kinds of drugs from the medical community. Yeah. So I think with gene doping, you will have doctors who are going to be willing to, go underground and do this. But Nick, what you mentioned with the altitude tent business, which of course is a very interesting phenomenon, at one time there was a controversy about whether or not that should be looked at as a form of cheating, because you're doing something unordinary to your normal life. But with the gene doping business, there's the added problem that there's high technology involved here, and what you're doing is you're actually injecting a virus into your body. The virus is being used as a delivery system for the gene that codes for erythropoietin. Who knows what kind of side effects that is going to have? I mean, aside from the erythropoietin, just so it's a very murky area. But as Chris said, these athletes are young, and they think that they're invincible, right? And they will do anything when it comes to getting a medal. I mean, there have been all kinds of surveys about that, where athletes were asked, if you could be guaranteed to win a gold medal, would you trade that for 20 years of your life? Alex?
Tough question, very tough question. But I think most people
The correct
would say
answer
yes.
is no.
Correct, and what you would actually do is, I think, more difficult. I think, yes, of course, we all would aspire to be these moral people who follow the regulations and who protect integrity in sport, but I think the reality is, as an individual, it's not your fault if the whole system is sort of built for you to lean you towards one choice. And I think as an organization, which maybe sports organizations in Canada could do a better job of, is protecting the athletes from being put in that vulnerable position where you're very young, you don't really know what the risks and the benefits are, and you see all of the benefits of winning a really big gold medal, it change your life, and you don't see all the risks of what happens if you take it, you have all these side effects, you don't win the gold medal. On top of all of the moral dilemmas, I think it's a really difficult decision for any minor person to take. So I think organizations need to do a better job of informing people and guiding them and protecting them from these positions.
And I mean, you can tell us, because I don't know, but I mean, what if your source of funding is dependent on being part of the program? Do you really have the option to say no? If somebody says, here, take this.
Well, technically, yes. I mean,
technically, yes. But
yes,
imagine if you were on scholarship and your
Right.
scholarship is dependent on being part of the program. And if your coach says it's my way or the highway, I mean, you really don't have, your livelihood is at stake. It's not just winning the gold medal. It's about, eating.
No, exactly. And there's a big power dynamic in sport, athletes and coaches and organizations, and it's a separate issue. But for sure, you're in this position where sometimes you don't really have an option, technically, if you want to do the things that are meaningful to you or the things that pay the bills. This is the whole thing. And for a lot of athletes, sport is their whole career. Yeah. They don't necessarily have something else that can have them have a living. So it's really difficult for them when they're put in these situations where they can be unethical and gain an advantage, or they can be moral, but they're putting their livelihood at stake. And it's not always a fair position for them.
I think, too, the advantage can come early. So you talk about young athletes who would maybe take something to enhance their performance. That enhanced performance puts them in a better position where they're going to get better coaching, better opportunity. So that will give them the leg up as they're in that development phase to get into that next level of elite sport.
Yeah.
So they see the short-term gains, and they're there. Like absolutely they're there. And the long-term gains are, something that they don't bother to look at. So yeah, the opportunity for somebody who's much younger to kind of look at that and say, hey, if I can be better than so-and-so, I'm going to get the better coaching, the better hours on the ice, the whatever. And that opportunity can mean success.
An interesting case was East Germany, because that was a nation that was into doping before the West. It was all state sanctioned. And those athletes didn't know anything about it. They were told, here, take these vitamins. And they just took it. There was absolutely no questioning that. And I remember in 1976, I was doing some lab work testing the urine of athletes at the Montreal Olympics. And I had the chance to meet Cornelia Ender, who was the East German swimming champion. And I just remember when she walked into the room, I mean, I said to myself, this is a woman? I mean, she giant muscles, And so she was actually quite conversant. She spoke some English. And she said, well, vitamins, they tell us to take vitamins. That's what's happening.
And actually, some of the very few studies that we have looking at the effects of anabolic steroids on sports performance were done in Second World War Germany, because, as you say, they gave these vitamins to people and then observed what happened. There's a very old case from, I think it was the 1950s, and they gave testosterone to a female shot putter and watched what happened to her personal records and things like this. It's much harder to do now for ethical reasons. But let me just pose a hypothetical to the group to bring it back to this idea of gene doping, because we were talking earlier about the Tour de France, and in cycling, it's that sort of doping is quite widespread, and I think to be successful in that kind of sport, particularly in that environment of the Tour de France, people have to understand it's not that people are taking tablets, that they find, it's not some dodgy back alley deal. This is a very sophisticated, systematic doping program, and it's only successful because the athletes are in on it, coaches are in on it, the team doctors are in on it. It only works because everyone is complicit. In that kind of institution, I personally don't think it's very far-fetched that they could implement some kind of gene doping program.
It's not impossible, but it's going to be harder because it's going to require more technology. And the more complex you make it, the more people are involved, and the more likely you are to find that one whistleblower who will bring everything down. Right. So again, I agree with you. It's not impossible. I think it's going to be harder because it's not like, because you can get stuff illegally, right? You can get products, you can get medication. But to create a medical facility where you could do this, and again, it depends how the technology evolves. Maybe it will become so simple that you could do it in your back office. I think it's going to be harder unless it's some sort of state-sanctioned thing in a state where we just don't have transparency, and then you think about Russia, China, and some other countries. I think it would be harder to do somewhere like kind of in the US, because somebody would say, this is crazy, right? And especially now in the days of the internet, all it's going to take is one person to take one video on a phone, and then everything will just blow up.
And presumably they're doing this kind of research in labs and hospitals anyway, because it has clinical applications, right? It's the same with like myostatin deficiency. So myostatin is a growth regulator, and myostatin is important because it stops our muscles from growing out of control. So if we suppress myostatin through gene editing, then it has implications in muscle wasting disease, but you could also create a super athlete. So maybe you could sneak your athlete in the back door of this lab where they're treating patients.
And I mean, again, it's going to come down to how we write the laws, right? I mean, you can, if you're selecting genes in an embryo, I mean, you can make the decision to not select for that gene because you know it's going to lead for disease, and yet it is illegal to select for eye color, hair color, stuff like that. So again, the laws of this country are whatever we want them to be, and so I think we can eventually craft something that says, yes, we can certainly use gene editing to treat disease like cystic fibrosis, like thalassemia, and not use it for things that are, to a large degree, elective, like I want to be taller and faster. I want to be better at sports. And again, we get the society we want. We just have to elect the governments that are going to write this and enshrine them into the laws.
Well, this is a great introduction to our next point about the enhanced games. A lawyer, Aaron D'Souza, has been getting a lot of publicity because he says, you can't control this stuff. Governments aren't willing to control it, or it may not be technically possible to control it. Why not just let it go? Let it be the Wild West. Everyone fend for themselves. Do whatever you want. He wants to organize the enhanced games.
Yeah. I will argue against that for one very important reason, and it harkens back to the issue that we said before, is that a lot of the athletes who are going to be the victims of this are young and vulnerable and don't actually have the option to say no. If you want to do something like this in 40-year-olds that are no longer in the Olympic circuit, who are doing this in a separate league, maybe you could make the argument. I would still argue against it because you are putting these people at risk. And I don't think that they have the capacity to freely understand the risk given the framework of how this stuff operates. But my main objection is that no, because this is happening to young people who often don't have the option to say no because they are, to a large degree, it sounds like, I'm not a student athlete, so I don't know. But from the experience that I've seen, a lot of them are not being told what's going on, and they're being largely forced into these things by outside players who are using them for their own nationalistic purposes.
But let's say something like the Tour de France,
Yeah.
which is not a student business. What if the organizers of the tour say, okay, look, we know that all of this muck is happening anyway. Let's just make it all legal so that everyone at least has the same chance of using whatever technology is available.
I understand the argument for it. Why I would be against it is because our whole objective now is making sports safer, right? We have a growing awareness of the issue of chronic head trauma in football. We're not telling people don't play football. We're trying to make football safer. The whole invention of the helmet in football was to prevent skull fractures, which has largely been resolved. People do not die on the football field anymore the way they did a century ago. Now the issue is chronic long-term trauma and CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy from the ball. So we're trying to make sports safer, right? We want people to bicycle ride. We want the Tour de France to happen, but we want to make it safe for the people who participate, and that's the issue, because the issue with EPO is that it's not a benign substance. Take too much of it, get your red blood cell count high enough, it increases your risk of heart attack and stroke. Like, there is a risk to this. That is why these rules exist. It's not just about, playing fair. There is a health risk to it, and again, because of the climate, even when we're talking about adults, it's maybe less so. But even then, you're like, well, I have to do this to compete. You have a long life ahead of you after you stop being an athlete. I mean, average life expectancy now is into the 80s, and it's very plausible that a lot of these people are going to live into their hundreds. You have an entire lifetime to go after you're done being an athlete, and you don't want that lifetime compromised by chronic disease. That's not in your best interests in any way, shape, or form.
And just the financial aspect. So, if we look at sport is expensive enough. Now, to be at the highest level, you're going to have to spend more on whatever supplements that are there. And so who is it going to be, the richest or the people who have access to the most amount of money who are now going to rise to the top? Yeah. So and not all countries will have the same opportunities. So what happens to our international sport venue? So I think there's that to look at as well.
All right, let's get down to something more at the level of the average person. The next point that I'd like to discuss, and let me just read this. So an exercise physiologist once stated that everyone knows that booze and tobacco are bad for us, but if physical inactivity was packaged and sold as a product, it would need to carry a health warning. Sitting is the new smoking, another phrase very often used today. So what do we make of this comment? That sitting is the next smoking?
I mean, yeah, it depends how you want to look at it. I mean, if you know, it's very hard to compare those two things. But I mean, I think most people would say that smoking is obviously worse for you. But physical inactivity is bad. That slogan was largely used to convey a very specific message. Was that smoking was the great public health challenge of the previous generation, and we have largely not eliminated it, but we have severely reduced it to the point that we have seen decreases in one of the reasons why we're seeing a continuous decrease in cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease mortality is because we have tackled the issue of smoking relatively effectively in the past few decades and gotten smoking rates down, not to zero, mind you, but we've gotten them way down from what they were. The big public health challenge of this generation is going to be sedentary behavior. And so to say sitting is the new smoking is not to equate the two in the biological sense, but to say that this is a challenge we need to face because we do have a very sedentary society. We are basically acting out the subplot of the movie WALL-E. And if you haven't seen that movie, you definitely should because it's amazing. But we are doing that, right? We're becoming more and more sedentary. And so unless we become conscious of it, unless we actually pass legislation to reverse the process, we're going to have an issue. And people say, what do you mean pass legislation? Well, the way we design our cities matters, right? The way we design school curricula for gym class matters. The way we fund and issue tax credits for after-school sports matters. All the things that we do affect how physically active we are as a society. And so if we can make these conscious decisions, we can start to reverse the process. In the same way, anti-smoking laws didn't just magically manifest themselves. We decided to make them happen, and it took decades of incremental work. And this is going to take decades of incremental work, and it has to be done on a city-wide, almost to at an urban planning level.
There's a big difference between the two. Is that getting people to stop smoking requires them to stop doing something.
Yeah.
Getting people physically active means they have to start doing something. And humans are inherently lazy. We like to conserve energy, we like to conserve calories at every opportunity. And we know that long periods of sitting is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So irrespective of how active you are in the rest of the day, they've done studies in competitive athletes, and they found that even the individuals who are training 2 or 3 times a day, if they are sitting down for long periods in between training sessions, they have a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, they have more body fat, and so on and so forth. So sitting generally is for long periods is bad. And if you look at 90% of the jobs that we have nowadays all require us sitting, usually.
Well, we've been sitting here for an hour. So I think we're going to have to start to wrap up, and I knew we wouldn't get through all of these discussion points. But let's go to the very last one, which I think is interesting. I generally like to ask people that I talk to or that I interview who are experts in whatever field, is what they have done themselves based on everything that they have learned through their career. Because obviously you do make changes if you become convinced of something through your own reading or research. So that's the question. All of you have lived lives in the world of science. You've read, you've done research, whatever. What have you applied to yourself? Now, I know, Nick, you're going to... He runs ultra marathons. Yeah. I don't want to hear that. Beside that.
Well, actually, related to that, I actually made a conscious decision to run fewer ultra marathons.
Yeah.
The last probably 10 years or so.
I'm not sure ultra marathons are good for your health.
They're not. Like, if you look at the literature, and we've published a bunch of studies on this now, if you compete in marathons or ultra marathons as a lifelong athlete, you have a greater risk of cardiovascular disease. So, look, exercise is good for you, physical activity is good for you, but if we treat exercise as a medicine, which we tend to do, there is a minimum dose that's required to have an effect, there's an optimal dose, and then there's a toxic dose. And probably going out and running for 100 miles is it could be considered a toxic dose. So actually, based on my research and based on learning more and understanding more, I'm now a little bit more conservative.
You're only running 90 miles.
I do it less often, put it that way.
But it gets to the question, like, why are you doing it? Are you doing it to be healthy, or are you doing it because you enjoy the activity?
Yeah.
Right?
It's the latter, right? Of
It's
course.
the latter, right? People run marathons not because they really want to run. I mean, they do it because it's the you want to say you did it. You want to cross it off your bucket
You have
list.
to do it informed, educated,
Yeah.
so that you can make an informed decision.
That's right.
But I would say I also am a runner and a swimmer, but I've taken on more shorter, higher intensity exercise because we know now that there are benefits for having, versus a long, slow run. So I've incorporated more of those types of workouts, which is great for time management. So realizing that you don't need to go out and exercise for an hour or even 30 minutes at a time. You can do shorter bouts of higher intensity exercise more often. And that's a change that I have made to my workouts, and it's been great.
Alex, you haven't had as many years behind you to make up your mind, but have you incorporated anything based on your experience?
Well, I used to be a high-performance athlete, and now I decided to stop doing high-performance and maybe transition a little bit into coaching. And it was a weird transition because my whole identity was in sport, or at least most of it. And I was kind of lost as to, do I still do sports? Should I still do it? Is it still good for me? And I think now the answer that I have is that sport is great for my health. Health is physical, it's social, it's psychological, and I think sport for me, it touches on all three aspects. Physically, I'm doing something. Socially, I'm with my teammates and people that I spend a lot of time with. And mentally, it sort of like touches that part of my identity that reminds me like I'm not just a student, or I'm not just like my occupation or my job or my other relationships, but I'm this person in sport as well. So I think that physical activity is great, but it also isn't everything in health, and you need to touch other parts such as mental and social things as well.
Now that you're a medical student, have you given up fencing and decided to stop stabbing people?
No, I love to stab people. And I think despite the busy schedule that comes with medical school, I'm still really motivated to stay involved in sport because I know it's so good for my health. And I think as a future medical professional, it's kind of hypocritical to make decisions that aren't good for your health and then counsel your patients, oh, you should make lifestyle changes. You should make things for, like, time for things that are important to you. So I think a big part of being a health professional and leadership more in general is modeling. For me, part of that is staying true to what I think is important to me, which is sports.
Well, you can go into surgery and stab people for real.
It's true, for a living, yeah.
Beth?
I've always been super active, whether I've been a competitive athlete, or recreationally competitive athlete, or now just, exercising for the love of it. That hasn't changed, but I did, move to Ottawa to take advantage of a Gatineau Park, which has hundreds of kilometers of cross-country ski trails, because I skate ski, and you can ride your bike there without being in traffic, lots of hiking, etc. And there was also an opportunity for me to keep my horse at a place where I could ride my bike 30K out, ride back 30K. So when I'm training my horse, I'm still getting my exercise on the way. So the commuting, to other activities and to work is something that I added in after I moved away from Montreal. And certainly in my research in the National Women's Runner Study that I did, the women that were the healthiest were not the ones that were, running the most. They were the ones who were actually running, but also doing many other physical activities out throughout their day, including commuting to work, walking their dogs, those types of things. So I've definitely taken that as a piece to add into my sort of exercise arsenal. And on the food side, making sure I have a protein-rich breakfast and eating breakfast every day has been something that I definitely have adopted and never looked back on.
You put blueberries in there?
Well, there are many other fruits that can, give you that advantage. So yes, I have fruit at the same time.
Chris?
I was not always an active person. I got into running fairly late. It's not something I did my whole life. And it was a friend of mine got me into it, and I eventually came to the realization that I needed to be active because I realized I wasn't. And there's a lot of reasons why you cannot be active. You're busy with work, you're busy with school. It's easy to understand how people fall into this trap. And I, at one point, just had to make the decision to actually do it. And I did that by signing up for a half marathon and knowing that I had to train for it. And then once I did that, then I signed up for a marathon, and now running has become part of my regular routine, and I do it almost every day. There are days when I don't run because things happen, but I do try to do it almost every day, and that's become part of my routine. And I wish I had a more active job. I wish I didn't have to be sitting down for most of the day, but I can't do much about that. I can't quit yet. I will one day, but I can't quit yet. And so the only thing I have power over is what do I do in my evenings, and I carve out an hour to do a run, and that works well for me. So the lesson that I learned, and hopefully most other people too, is like find something that fits in your schedule and do that. Do the thing that isn't sitting on the couch watching television. That's probably the best medical advice that you can receive if you're trying to be healthier.
Okay, one last question. You've all stated what you decided to do based on your knowledge. Is there anything that you've decided not to do based upon your life experience?
Not to do. I mean, I am...
Even nutritionally.
Oh, nutrition. Well, I said the idea was not... Well, nutritionally, I am... Oh, yeah, so here's a good one. I used to drink a lot of juice. And again, this has probably just been ingrained from childhood, where I went to school, I had my lunchbox, had my juice box in there. And it eventually became clear, as I think it has to most people, there's a lot of sugar in juice. You're better off drinking water. And so getting away from liquid calories, which we see in a lot of juice, is a health choice that I made. But it took me a lot longer than it probably should have to realize that that was a thing. And it's like, I have to change this behavior. And so that's hard because I still have an instinct. When you're having breakfast, you got to have orange juice because that's what you do. And I still have a glass of milk when I have breakfast because that's what I always did. I had a glass of milk in my Mickey Mouse mug. And, that mug is broken now. I broke it last week. But that's what I do. And so we have these habits, and they're hard to break. But those are the types of changes you make. You're like, there's a lot of sugar here. This is not good for me. I need to make a conscious decision to break away from that instinct.
Beth?
I don't drink alcohol at all. There's no safe amount of alcohol to drink. So that's something I definitely now don't do.
Yeah, that's another one, actually. That's very true. Yeah.
And in fact, alcohol-free beer, they can't keep it on the shelves, and they can't, people are drinking it up like crazy. So there is a bit of a trend towards these alcohol-free drinks. And I don't eat ultra-processed foods.
Jill?
I used to run up Mount Royal almost every day and run down, which is about 4K up and about 4K down. And I eventually got a knee and hip issue, so I have limited my uphill running, which used to be a really big part of my training.
I used to do that too. I don't enjoy the difference of up and down.
Well, the downhill I think is more impact, so I think it's actually more the downhill where I was having trouble, and especially 4K down.
Yeah, it's not great.
So I've, I'll run up, but I'll walk down.
And my gripe is the snow doesn't melt until May. Just because of the shade, so it's not. I've never found that a practical place to run.
So that forced me to change my training habits for sure.
Alex?
I don't try to push my limits every time I go and exercise anymore. I think as an athlete, we're training for goals and competition and for performance. I was there to push and get better, do big workload. But now I'm trying to learn how to maybe cut down on that a little bit and to just go and to just be active and not necessarily have to push towards perfection. So I'm trying to not be a perfectionist in health anymore.
Well, something that I've stopped doing, I'm keen to see a show of hands from the panel and maybe the audience as well. How many of you, the first thing you do when you wake up is look at your mobile phone? How many of you do that?
It depends, yeah.
Okay, some of you. And how many of you look at your mobile phone the last thing you do before you go to bed?
That I don't do. That I don't
So
do anymore.
the thing that I've stopped doing is bringing my mobile phone into my bedroom because like most people, I would have my mobile phone on my nightstand and I would look at it before I go to bed, and then as soon as you wake up, you reach for your phone, it became habitual. And I think especially most young people do that, or younger people do that, I would say. Probably most young adults, I would say, almost do that exclusively. And I've realized that was a very unhealthy habit. So something that I don't do anymore is have my mobile phone in the bedroom. So it goes in the office, and maybe even turn it off. and I have that time when I go to sleep where I'm
How do you come to the conclusion that this is unhealthy?
Because I noticed that I was doing it every day and I was spending too much time on my phone. And when you reach for this thing, the first thing you do when you wake up, and it's the last thing you do when you go to bed, if you're in any way mindful about your behaviors, you realize that this is a habit. It's habit forming. And they're designed this way, particularly with social media, smartphones. They're in cahoots with each other. They design these programs to tap into human behavioral psychology because it's habitual, because it's addictive. And so I think if you're in any way mindful about these things, I don't think it's good to have any kind of habit like that is addictive. So I think just setting up some boundaries. I'm not saying you have to stop using a phone or anything, but for me it's been very beneficial just to set up those boundaries.
Well, it's also bad for sleep disruption, right? Having that screen time late at night is not good for helping you fall asleep. A lot of people who have insomnia would probably benefit from not having a phone the 30 minutes before they go to bed.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here, threw out some interesting stuff, and you get a taste for what is to come tonight and tomorrow night. So tonight, right here at 6 o'clock, Beth and Nick will be giving you more of what you just heard here. And tomorrow night, I'll be sitting here chatting with Dick Pound. Dick was former Canadian swimming champion. He was an Olympic athlete, former chancellor of McGill, and the first head of the World Anti-Doping Agency, and an arch enemy of Armstrong. So you're going to hear a lot about that. He is quite vocal about what he thinks should be happening in the world of sports in terms of doping. So I think that should be a fascinating conversation. So obviously, those of you who are watching wherever it is that you're watching, you can watch again online tonight at 6 o'clock or tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And if you don't know exactly where people should watch, if you want to tell your friends, at this point, I think the best thing I can tell you, go to our website, which is mcgill.ca/OSS, and all you have to do is click on the watch button there, and you'll get the link to watch. So thanks to all of the panelists here, and thank those of you who came here in person, and thanks to those of you watching somewhere in the world. And again, we invite you again, 6 o'clock tonight and 7 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.